Begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Can I please ask for a roll call?
Commissioner Bergman.
Present.
Commissioner Marsters.
Present.
Commissioner Harper Pedersen.
Present.
Vice Chair Gutierrez.
Present.
And Chair Silberman.
Present. So the next item is public comment. Seeing that there's absolutely no one from the public here, I'm going to not read the entire thing. Is there anyone here for public comment that is hiding behind the lectern? No? Okay. Moving on to the minutes. We've got two sets of minutes. Why don't we start with the shorter ones, the one from November 17th. Does anyone have any changes for the November 17th minutes?
Nope.
No.
Then I would entertain a motion to approve.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? None? Okay. Moving on to the November 3rd minutes. Sorry, I was laughing at Angela. I'm sorry, not laughing at Angela,
Sure.
laughing with Angela and her
about
and
Angela.
her remote location at East Northern Lights Boulevard. Could you see the Northern Lights from your location?
You actually could see the Northern Lights one night. It was that vivid.
Awesome.
2:30 a.m.
All right.
Yep.
Does anyone have any changes to the November 3rd minutes? Scott, you got anything?
Nope.
Your name appears more than any other name in the minutes, so I figured I'd ask you specifically.
Yeah.
Then I would entertain a motion to approve.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
I'm going to
Opposed?
abstain because I wasn't there. So.
Okay, 4 yes, 1 abstention, and no no's. All right, moving on to the presentation and summary of the 2013 downtown parking study and review of parking management strategies. And you do, as far as I'm concerned, you do not need to go to the lectern. You can sit right where you are. We won't tell anybody. I mean, I guess this is recorded, so if you feel it'll reflect poorly on the planning division, you can go ahead and, or you prefer to stand, you can assume the lectern, but if you're more comfortable sitting, that's fine with me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And normally I would stand at the lectern. Tonight I will take you up on your offer. Good evening, Honorable Chair and members of the Commission. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. We all have gone through the elation of finding that perfect parking space right in front of the retail business, and it's free, and you find that perfect parking space. And we've also suffered together going around and around in circles on the street looking for the parking and having to walk a block to get to where we're going. Such is the case of San Carlos. Depending on who you talk to, and your own experiences, you may find that perfect spot right in front of Tutti Frutti, or you may have to drive a while to get there. But eventually we all seem to get to where we're going in downtown San Carlos. So tonight what the Planning Commission has asked for is an overview of what we're doing about parking and parking study in San Carlos. And also a little bit about where we're going with this study and what we're going to do about it as the Planning Commission looks at development, and to give you context, because you all make recommendations and make decisions about development in and around the downtown San Carlos. So what I thought I'd start off with is what the first phase. So the parking study is really two phases. And the first phase was we wanted to find out where we are as a community. The last parking study was done in around 1999 or something like that. So it had been quite some time, almost 15 years or so, since we've studied parking in our city. So we decided that it was time to take another hard look at where we are. And so before you make any decisions with this kind of thing, you need to find out, well, what are the existing conditions in your community? And you have to have the data. What are people actually doing versus what you think people are doing or what you think you're doing? So here's how we started. And we started with a number of goals. We wanted to look at our existing parking supply and look at occupancy. And occupancy refers to where people are parking, but also, perhaps more importantly, how long are people parking in certain areas. We heard there are several different areas in the community where we've heard historically there's parking impacts. One is around the GSC neighborhood in the historic core of the downtown, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then we're starting to see at the south end of Laurel, we call it the SOLA area, south of Laurel area, SOLA. The SOLA area, we've heard that because of the popularity of some of the newer restaurants down there and some of the business, we're starting to get some pressure down in this area that's actually been pretty quiet for a number of years. So we wanted to take a look at, again, these three areas in particular, and also people talk about different events like Hot Harvest Nights, SF Giants game impacts, and things like that. So we wanted to look at the data during those as well. So what process did we use? Well, this was a really critical issue. The council has been involved. We had a council subcommittee, a city council subcommittee that provided guidance throughout the process and helped to set up the parameters of this. Staff brought them the initial parameters, and they provided guidance. So we had guidance from the city council way in the very beginning. We also thought it was very important to get the merchants involved through the Chamber of Commerce, have public meetings. The Transportation and Circulation Commission is the primary recommendation body to the city council when it comes to on-street parking or public parking. We also had a parking advisory committee meeting and a merchant and user surveys, and we'll talk a little bit about each of these things. So in terms of what we found about existing downtown parking supply, we have between public and private spaces, on-street and off-street, and the Samtrans parking garage, we have about 2,217 parking spaces in the downtown area, in the surrounding environs there. As you can see on that page, you'll see the different types. So there's different types, and we talked about occupancy, and some are 20 minutes, some are 24 hours, 2 hours and such. And the intent of that is, depending on where you are in the community, the idea is to have turnover so that more people get a chance to shop and do what they need to do. And certain areas of the community have different needs and there's different demand in different peak hours of operation and things like that. So you try and time your parking to match what's actually happening out there. So Samtrans Garage has some spaces. Over the years, we've talked a lot about the Samtrans Garage and how much surplus parking might be over there. And what's real interesting as well is there's a lot of private parking in the downtown, and you'll see how that plays into our future strategy as we go through this. But there's different types of on-street public parking in terms of our parking supply. In terms of timing, and it's interesting once you start breaking this information down, because it starts to make sense or not make sense as you look at what's happening. And 58 or almost 60% of on-street parking is 2 hours. And as you'll see later, most people come to downtown and they make more than one visit. And the question is 2 hours enough? Or is 1 hour enough? And maybe there needs to be more or less of these different types of parking restrictions. Then there's open lot parking. Open lot parking is like Wheeler Plaza, there's Williams Plaza, Clark Plaza, and South Plaza. So we have 4 public parking plazas in the downtown area, and that's what this refers to. And it shows you how those plazas versus on-street are regulated. So the on-street, if you go back, 60% of it is 2 hours, whereas in the open lot, you have a little more time. at least for 40% of the park, almost 35% of the parking, you have a little more time to do things. So they give you a little break if you park in the main parking lot there. Downtown parking supply is a whole total and public parking in the downtown. What's interesting here is about 40% of the total number of parking is private. Again, it's a big piece of the pie when you start to look at how to manage parking in and around the downtown, and we'll talk about why later. So here's where we start to get into the detail of the study. And on the left-hand side of your screen there, you'll see the different color blocks there, or the different parking areas. For instance, the green one is Wheeler Plaza. And what we did is we looked at the parking during peak hours. And peak hours tend to be, we said, well, it's about 1 o'clock when everybody's at lunch or leaving lunch. So that typically in most downtowns is the peak hour. And so we looked at peak hour operations of all our on-street, public, private, and the parking lots there. And what you can see there, what's interesting is 74%, for instance, of Wheeler Plaza is parked. If you go down the street to Williams Plaza, you get to about 91%. That's behind town there. And if you're talking to a traffic engineer or a parking expert, what they'll tell you is you don't really have a parking problem until you get to 85%. So if you're at 85% at your peak hour, you're right on the tipping point of having a real problem where people are more frustrated than usual. So
The 74% in Wheeler Plaza, does that include the permit spaces that are in Wheeler Plaza? Because I just kind of wonder whether if you were to eliminate those spaces, which are often frustratingly open when the lot is otherwise parked up, whether that would actually be much higher than 74%.
I believe they just counted spaces. They didn't eliminate the employee spaces, employee permit parking. So it's just all the spaces that were available. So you have a point there. Across the street, you're getting up to 83%, 78%. Now, on the other side of the screen, on the right-hand side, you see that the private occupancy is lower, generally lower than the public occupancy. A little bit. In some areas, like Wheeler, you're about the same. But down toward South Plaza, across the street from there, maybe a little farther down toward Arroyo, you're down in the 60 percentile. And the farther away you get from the central core of those first few streets, San Carlos, Cherry, Olive, when you get to Walnut, Elm Street, where you have to maybe walk a block, you'll probably find a parking space pretty easily there. So downtown parking occupancy in the peak hour for at least on street, that's again not in the parking plazas there, you're about 75% at the peak. Well, it's not 85%, but it's pretty high. Downtown off-street public parking, you're right at that tipping point. You're right at about 85%. So what we know is that we probably are starting to have a problem, and we should really take a serious look at that from at least the public parking occupancy standpoint. And we should get out in front of this before it gets worse.
So, did people observe like that prior 75% statistic for on-street parking? Did people observe that just seemed very not consistent with their experience? Because there's never an open space, ever an open space on Laurel Street in the downtown core during a peak period.
One of the things you have to understand is this survey was done 2 years ago.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Okay, and so in the last 2 years, there have been so many restaurants that opened up and so many businesses that have come in that this is already 2 years outdated. So we're probably well past that 85% at this point.
That's just in that time frame.
Yeah, not to mention the future projects that are actually coming.
Okay. Sorry.
So, and again, maybe it's counterintuitive if you're walking down Laurel Street, but if you want to go one block away on Walnut, if you're behind, for instance, Wheeler Plaza, you could probably find a spot. But it's frustrating to do that. So
I just always park on the other. I can almost always find a spot if I cross San Carlos Avenue and go on the other side. I did that last night when I got my burrito. But anyway, keep going.
And that's what happens. If you're willing to walk, you're probably going to find a parking space. So off-street private parking occupancy 65% in the peak hour. And that what did we say? That was about 40% of the total parking spaces in the downtown is private.
And are we talking about like the spots in the bank? Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, it's spots in the bank, and there's a whole bunch of spots that are kind of tucked behind buildings around all the plazas. You'll see them there. They're right against, a lot of them are right against the building, and those are not San Carlos parking spaces. And this is the case for, there's actually perhaps more private parking in the South Laurel area, because you see bigger parking lots down there. So 65% off-street parking occupancy. On and off-street overall, 70% on and off-street parking downtown. On and off-street parking public is 78%. So we're still pretty high. And there is a level of frustration with the number of folks in the community. Now, as you'll see later in the presentation, it depends on who you ask. So hot harvest nights, for instance, I mean, you can pretty much guess the answer, the data on this one, right? On the left-hand side of your screen, you see 93%. It's just packed. Now, hot harvest nights, unusual, outlier situation. Yes, the parking is pretty significant on that night. If you go to my trick is to go to South Plaza behind Bianchini's, I usually find something there. There's a lot of turnover there. And that shows 74% in that parking lot in G there. And I typically, don't, or I park right down the street from there, and you can see.
That one's probably 74% because of the Bianchini spaces that you can't park in unless you're actually shopping there, which usually have, 5, 10 open spaces.
Mm-hmm. And some of those are private. The public ones are right behind those, behind the oak tree out toward Walnut.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, there's
Downtown parking study. Let's see, peak parking occupancy, downtown private. Again, real high, pretty much the same. Although, again, you see those green boxes on the sort of the outlying areas of the downtown core, still lower than the public side. Now, let's go to the greater East San Carlos neighborhood around the train station, around Loreola Park. So for many years, there's been concern about and the pressure in these neighborhoods out here from they're surrounded by businesses. They're right near the Caltrain station. We wanted to look at non-Giants game days and Giants game days. I don't know if I included the Giants game day in here, but
I'm sorry, can I interrupt you for
Yeah.
a second? How do they measure? Is this by people walking around and taking measurements, or are there counters that are put there and timers? Is it done mechanically or by people on?
they have people with counters.
Okay.
Yeah, so they walk the street and they observe it and count. And so what you see, for instance, on the left side of the screen there, study area, so that is about non-Giants Day Friday. What you see is San Carlos Avenue around the industrial businesses and the commercial businesses right along the train station, red. You're up there 90, 100% parking. In the neighborhoods, it's a little lower than you would anticipate in the 30 or 40 percentile, and some streets get up to 60 or 70%. But the frustration that you may find from a neighbor is maybe they could park on their block, but they have to walk down the block. Or, they see a car or cars in front of their house that, they don't know. And so, it is frustrating. It creates an issue in the residential realm that's, just different than it should be than the commercial realm. So we looked at that. It was a little bit different than what we anticipated, but we can understand some of the concerns. On the right hand, what's interesting to me, let's see, that's Saturday. what you'll see is purple at McHugh and some red, and that's when the soccer games are occurring. So you see more, athletic events over at Loreola Park during that day. So you have tendency to have higher parking rates around Loreola Park at that time. SF Giants game parking. So we did look at that. As you'd imagine, it's a little higher, but not a whole lot higher, which is kind of interesting. And I think what we found with this is that people are more likely to, or somewhat likely to kind of be afraid to miss the train, and they end up paying for the parking in the commuter parking lot. I know that's been my psychology when I go to the Giants games. Is I'm nervous. I won't park for. I'd rather pay a few extra bucks and make sure that I get on that train and get up to see the Giants game. So you'll see the commuter parking lot a little more full, but it doesn't impact the neighborhood as strongly as maybe we anticipated, but you do get more of those people parking in the neighborhood. This was last year's Giants, I believe. Let's see, it was 2012. It was a World Series year. Yeah, so it was a World Series year. Yeah, okay. And I thought we had the team they played too on there somewhere.
The second one was the San Diego Padres.
Very good. South of Arroyo, again, as we discussed earlier, there's a lot of change that's occurring down here. It makes more mixed-use development, a lot of real popular restaurants. You've got the Office, the Salt Box, Three Pigs. And so you're really starting to see more activity. And the concern is, well, how does this affect the neighboring residential areas? And as you can see, the residential areas, there is some impact to those neighborhoods, although it's generally below 50%. So you can generally, like on Elm Street and some of the side streets, you're going to be able to find parking in your neighborhood. Now, down near the Office, you see the red on the left side of the screen, Friday at lunchtime. And then on Saturday at 1 o'clock, you still see a little red in that area. And then in the central part between Howard Street and Belmont, there's a lot of activity, and that's Trader Joe's down there. So you'll see more activity around the Trader Joe's, and there is a restaurant there. So you see more activity there. But it's a little more complex what's happening in this area. But I do think that this is an area that requires a lot of attention in the coming months and years. So, yes.
If you go back one, so these were all done at 1 o'clock, whereas the real impact to the neighborhood usually is in the 5 o'clock hour when people are trying to come home. I mean, at 1 o'clock in the middle of the day, you wouldn't expect to see much in the neighborhood. You would expect a lot of parking because people are at work. Whereas if you looked at 5 o'clock and the Office is going full swing, and all the restaurants are open and everything, I think this would be a totally different picture at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I think that there's a lot of the things from the residential neighborhoods would have a much more significant impact.
Point well taken.
On Figure 14, it says in the bottom left-hand corner, it says off-street observation 5 p.m., on-street observation 7 p.m. Do you know what that means?
Yeah, I was going to say that I think that there was an evening study done as well. And if you look at the appendix, yeah, there was. So they did both lunch and the peak hour in the evening as well. So you do have that data. You just got to kind of dig around for it. Now, there's different perceptions about parking, and if you just kind of ask people, and I've done a lot of this, what's your experience finding parking, and you'll get different opinions and from different types of people. For instance, we did a number of different surveys. We surveyed business owners versus customers, so they're two different groups of people, and we received a very good amount of surveys, 248, which is a good turnout, 24 from the business owners and 217 for the customers. So it's kind of more heavily weighted on the customers, but they said slightly different things. Business owners, and it shows you just at the bottom of the page, you know, what type of business owners and where they parked. Business owners, 70% of those folks perceived a parking problem. And you can imagine, you know, if you were a business owner, your concern is, hey, how do my clients and my employees get to my place of business? Suggested, and they made some suggestions. We asked people, well, what do you think we should do? And they wrote in. So you'll see, you know, provide free parking at Samtrans, better signage, Wheeler Plaza, more parking, don't put in parking meters, and that's not on the table. And then survey of customers. Less people in the customer group felt that there was a problem. Nearly half parked on the street. About 1/3, a little more than 1/3 of the people, the customers, saw a parking problem, which is kind of an interesting differentiation between the two groups. But another interesting fact is most people, when they go downtown, they tend to visit more than one business. Mostly we do that. They had some suggestions as well, very similar to what other folks were saying. Better signage is something that shows up. Add a parking structure. Shared parking. This is something that is actually quite promising, and people are starting to see. Add more high turnover parking spaces. Sometimes people just want to get in and out, and maybe they'll even drive a block or two and go to the other business. They just want to unload something. No parking meters again. So what's the summary? Well, we know how much parking we have, and we know that about 40% of it is private, and it's underutilized generally. Samtrans parking garage is fairly significant. It's over 300 spaces, and it's, I think, and we believe that it's underutilized to some extent. Peak parking, about 75% on the street, off the street. We're getting up there to where we really do have a problem, and the private side is lower than that. Total, if you average everything out, it's a little lower, but I think it doesn't matter. We know that we need to get out in front of this. And then we saw the other areas. South of Arroyo, occupancy is still down in the manageable range of 62%, but as you have all noted, there's changes that are occurring there. So what are we going to do? What's the next phase? So we have all this data, and it was very helpful to get a snapshot of who we are and where we park in and around our downtown. So now we have embarked on phase 2, and so the council has funded this second phase, and now it's about potential parking strategies. And of these strategies, you know, what are the pros and cons of these strategies? What are the costs of some of these strategies? And what are the best ones? What should we employ? And we don't have that study yet. It's being put together by our parking engineer, TJKM. We know some existing tools may be underutilized. One, I think that's quite interesting is this concept of a parking in lieu fee. And a parking in lieu fee is actually in our municipal code now. And what it says is, in the downtown, if you can't provide the parking for your development on site, you can pay a fee to the city, which will go toward the creation or maintenance of parking. And we have not utilized this parking in lieu fee for many, many years, if at all. And what's interesting about it is, at the time, and I think it was instituted quite some time ago, but at the time when I was working in Mountain View and I was working on the downtown plan for the city of Mountain View and trying to come up with parking solutions there very similar to what's happening here, I looked at San Carlos, and the unique thing that I found is this parking in lieu fee. And it was actually instituted in the city of Mountain View and is used quite heavily in the city of Mountain View. Same problems. They have a lot of development pressure, but very little land and to park in. Is very, very expensive to create parking. So this concept of a parking in lieu fee, I think, is really good and should be revisited. Enforcement, time limits, we talked about that. Shared use of private parking. And the reason I kind of touched on that so much is I think this is another area that we have seen, and I think other people recognize as an area of unutilized potential in our community. What if private property owners were approached at, like a rental agreement of some kind or a lease agreement for those private parking spaces that are underutilized? We actually had someone come in from one of the newer buildings on the South Laurel area to a council meeting and offer the council to lease those spaces for public use. So people actually out there, and it was suggested in our surveys, people actually get this stuff, and they're making suggestions. And that's another area, I think. Business Improvement District is something that we're also working on in the downtown core area. This could be where the downtown business owners get together and assess themselves, and that money that they assess themselves could go into parking. I think that we need to do a better job for education and mapping. We heard that from folks. And in some communities, you go into them and you see really good signage in and around the downtown, real good graphics, people from outside the community know where to go, and you get less circulation in your downtown if you have more people going right to where they need to go. We have smart technology now. We're using the Parker program, the Streetline program. We've got about 100 of these things, these little pucks in the downtown area that are being used. We get a lot of good data from that. We get occupancy data from that, and the police department actually uses that as well. And we're going to expand that in the coming months. Signage, freeway signs, additional employee permit parking is a real big issue and problem. That needs to be looked at. And there's a whole bunch of other things here. More surface or structured parking is sort of a no-brainer. Additional permit parking, demand reduction, residential parking. Permit parking is something that we are exploring now and trying to put together the funding sources to put together this program, starting with the Greater East San Carlos Neighborhood, TDM. And then this is something that I read about today. It was actually in the newspaper today, get ready for robo-parking. And this is sort of on the other side of the coin is private development parking strategies. And this isn't really a new idea. It's actually been used in Europe, and it came over to San Francisco. I think in Berkeley it's used a little bit. But on the peninsula, they're saying that this would be the first instance of private development using this mechanical parking, where you drive in and your car goes up and down and you can push a button and that kind of thing, and your car will be delivered to you. But it saves space. I'm not sure about cost on this, but I think with the price of land, it's going to be more and more attractive on the peninsula in San Mateo County, Santa Clara County. And with that, thank you, and we're open to answer questions.
So for the East San Carlos area, as part of the conditions of the transit village, was there would be a residential parking program instituted, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a great deal of interest in that. So that was one of the conditions of the development, is that the developer would start the seed funding for the start of that program. When they are issued a building permit, they will give the city $10,000. We've also recently applied for a grant that would give us even more funds to do a broader study of permit parking in our community, including implementation. Because we think that, as we saw in the South Laurel areas, the Walnut Streets and things like that, they're going to have they're starting to have the same issues, and we want to get out in front of that as well. So, it's an issue. We're probably going to start with some streets in the Greater East San Carlos neighborhood.
So where's the major ingress? Major ingress is what, San Carlos Avenue, right? And that's your major ingress. I mean, when you're looking at signage, are we thinking about, to get people to go into the Samtrans parking structure, is that one of the areas that we're looking at trying to route people through and so they don't go down Laurel? Is that under consideration? I don't know enough about the actual circulation to know for sure, but it seems to me that that's something makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what you have seen and suggested, it just makes sense. Like you say, I mean, San Carlos Avenue at El Camino is a gateway to our downtown core. So you want to funnel people around the edges of the downtown core, and you can access all of our parking, our public parking, from other streets other than Laurel Street. So yes, it would be providing really clear signage even before you get to the downtown sometimes. And maybe there's maybe there's an app or something, you know, before you go to San Carlos, that tells you how to get to those parking areas. But not only that, what would be great is, well, how many parking spaces are there available at this time? You know, maybe you've got a window of 15 minutes and there's more parking in one other parking area. So it'd be nice to be smarter about how we sign and how we get to people to where they're going. When we do the Wheeler Plaza parking structure, we will have, we're pushing for digital signage so that when you drive in, it'll tell you in green, here's how many parking spots are available at what level. And so that's the kind of technology we're headed in the direction of.
Just a quick question. On the parking in lieu, is there, I mean, what's the council's thought process? You said it was in the municipal code already. So why aren't we just implementing a fee?
Good question. It just, you know, it just was never implemented. I mean, maybe it was a couple of times, maybe 10 years ago. But what the planners had not been utilizing it. And so what happened is the accepted dollar value associated with an in lieu fee that would be a fair share amount just got really old, and it just kind of got buried in the record books. And we just discovered this very recently in going back and looking at parking issues. It's just something that if the historical information doesn't get passed on, sometimes nobody comes through and looks for this stuff. Yeah, so it's a matter of updating the dollar value associated with that, and then kind of re-accepting the fact that that's a good strategy that we should be using.
So that's going to be part of phase 2 of looking at all that TDM type plans. Mm-hmm. And then what about, I know we hit points basically on the data's somewhat old, especially, I mean, we were fortunate to have quite a number of successful restaurants that have come on since the study's been done. Wheeler Plaza and Transit Village too kind of play a little bit of a role. How does that kind of tie into everything?
I don't think the data's that old. You know, a couple of years, we've had some good, you know, new restaurants and things, but I'm not so sure that it's that, you know, different 2 years down the road. Maybe there are some pressure points and things like that. I really don't know if we'd get anything new. We know there's a problem. We know we need to solve the problem, so let's move forward with what we know. Now, you know, there's lots of different ideas floating around that I think we need to be crystallized. And part of it, like for Wheeler Plaza, for instance, we knew that we wanted to add parking to the downtown. So with that project, we will be adding 50 or 60 new parking spaces in a new public parking garage. There's 187 down there at Wheeler Plaza, so we'll be going to 237, 247. So we're adding, you know, and I think that's the first thing. The other thing that we're looking at when these private developments come through, and I think is another critical issue here that frees up a lot of parking right away, or at least when we get these buildings built, is employee parking. A lot of these residential developments, they don't use the parking during the 8 to 5 time frame. So what we've done with the Transit Village, for instance, or Samtrans, and what we've done with the Wheeler Plaza developers, we said, with your during the day, for instance, at Wheeler Plaza, we want the employees to be able to park underground and use the residential parking space. There's 190 parking spaces, private, that will be underutilized. So let's get those 50 or 60 people, you know, those employees down there. Well, like you said earlier, Mr. Chairman, it's frustrating when you want to park in those parking spaces and it says permit parking and you can't, and it's open. Well, perhaps we could eliminate all those parking spaces and just put them underground in a parking garage. Same thing with the Transit Village at the Transit Center. We negotiated as part of that development 100 parking spaces that we can use during after 5 p.m. every day of the week and on holidays. So that's 100 new parking spaces right across from the downtown. Of course, you'll have to walk a little bit, but that frees up quite a bit of parking. So those are the kinds of things we're trying to do with the new development. And I think that with the employee thing, I think if we can get those employees parked in another safe place that's off the beaten path, that frees up a tremendous surplus of parking.
No, I would agree. I think that, and what would be, can there be a temporary type measure with the employee parking? I mean, the Samtrans structure is really underutilized, and I read most of the surveys, and all of them basically said they don't think that if the employees were forced to park there, they would be fine with that. I mean, that would eliminate. I mean, that would probably add another 75 spots. I would think to the core.
That's a possibility. And it's something that we would need to negotiate with Samtrans, and I think they're open to that. I think that what we want to do is during the time that Wheeler is under construction, the way we're trying to work with that issue is we'll have valet parking on Laurel Street where the Foodville building is. That building will be taken out, and we'll have valet parking there, and they will utilize the Samtrans parking lot or maybe the Transit Center parking lot for the valet parking. So and maybe we'll have another valet parking space somewhere else around the downtown area too. So that we're kind of looking at near-term construction impacts, and we're trying to deal with that. But I think your point that maybe that could be utilized either in the interim before the construction or after is something that we can look at as part of phase 2.
Oh, no, I was just agreeing. I think for me, and I've spent a lot of time with the downtown study because I was on the little committee for it. So, and I have a different opinion of parking because I actually find San Carlos parking marvelous, and maybe that's because I spend too much time in San Francisco. So I think it's fabulous. With some notable exceptions. One of the things I do notice is I guess I'm more concerned about south of Arroyo than I am the downtown core, mostly because there doesn't seem to be a lot of overflow parking options the way there are in the downtown core. So I'm wondering what the strategies are going to look like there going forward.
Yeah, I think in the near term we have to use what's there, and so I think that the use of private parking spaces is the area that we are going to have to go for first, because there's more private parking areas down there that are like vacant. Several of them. If you walk down there at lunch, even at lunch or 11 or after lunch, you'll see dozens of parking spaces that are just sitting there. And so I think that is an area that we'll probably we should look at first, because you're right that there isn't public. There's not public parking lots down there. Right. And I think eventually we are going to have to look at more public parking in that area.
But I think that's kind of the heart of what some of us have been struggling with as we've been approving primarily we'll call them mixed use, although they're primarily residential developments down south of Laurel, is we're looking at the parking requirements of the ordinance, and we're saying, well, based on our experience, that's not going to be enough. When you've got whatever it is, 20 units. Well, actually, that's not a good example, but we had the one with I think it was 5 units and 9 parking spaces. We had a couple of those. In our experience, or my experience, that doesn't seem like it's enough. And then it doesn't seem like we have like a current strategy that is being implemented right now that is going to deal with the fact that parking seems impacted to us, and we're putting more development in there with what seems like insufficient parking. Mm-hmm. So like what's the how do we feel, or how do I feel better about approving those projects in the near term when there isn't an implemented strategy?
I would go look at one of those projects that you approved and go into it at 1 o'clock or noon. I know it's hard to do, but or we could videotape it for you or take pictures, Because if you go down to those residential developments that you have approved, for instance, at I think it's the 1673, is several unit. I think there's some condos and some commercial on the ground floor. All that commercial space is fully occupied, and those units sold out right away. And if you go there at 10 o'clock in the morning, there's 1 or 2 cars parked underneath. The people have gone to work in there or taken public transport, hopefully, and there's nobody there.
But what about it with 6 o'clock?
Same, you may have a few more people, but you know where the impact comes from. It doesn't come from the residential side of it. You can look at other development projects that are much more well established. For instance, the Pacific Hacienda. Go there at a peak hour at lunch or at 5. Same thing. If you go into that parking garage, you'll see lots of parking spaces. But where you have an issue is you have popular restaurants. That will draw a lot of people into an area at the same time. That's where you're getting the impacts and the pressure. It's the commercial, retail, restaurant, peak hour issue as opposed to the residential issue.
Well, I mean, if you're right, I mean, my concern has been that the 9 spaces for the 5 units was not going to be enough, and that all of those 9 spaces were going to be parked up, and then they were going to put another 2 or 3 cars on the street, and they were going to be competing, for parking at 6 o'clock for the folks who are going to those popular restaurants. That was the concern, and I mean, basically what I'm kind of asking you to tell me is, don't worry about it, it's not a problem.
But on the residential side, I don't see it. I really don't see it. And I think there's evidence to support that fact. And I think that we can provide that. I know it's counterintuitive, kind of doesn't make sense, but that's what I'm saying. Hey, go look for yourself. It's counterintuitive, but hey, if you go there and you check it out, and I've done that, and that's what we have to do, I think, as planners, is we have to get out of our space and go and look and see. And you can go to somewhere else. It doesn't have to be San Carlos. It could be another community that you work in and you see a development, peek in. Take a look at it. Get out and see what's actually happening. So the residential side, we just don't see it. And a lot of times people will say, and I've heard this before, it's not as bad as I thought it was going to be, or gosh, that didn't happen like I thought it was going to happen on the residential side. Again, with popular restaurants in downtown areas, it's a totally different animal. And I think you make a good point. I think that your skepticism is warranted, and I think that we can provide you with some pictures, or we can take you out there at some point. And
because that's really, I'm not going to speak for everyone, but that is what I've been struggling with lately, is approving those mixed-use developments, and I understand they are complying with our code. I mean, they're putting in the number of spaces that are required. It just doesn't seem like it would be enough to support the residential parking in the evening when I'm hearing from residents that there's no parking available. And, I recognize that sometimes residents say that, and it might not necessarily be true. I don't believe everything that I hear. But, it seems like we're hearing it awfully consistent, like every single time. That's one of the 3 things that we hear, in addition to height, which we can't necessarily do that much about. And, it feels like somehow we could very easily do something about parking. We could just require them to put in more spaces, and it would cost them more money, but we could require them to do that.
yeah,
And when I say we, I don't necessarily mean us.
Yeah.
We could advocate for the city council to increase the number of spaces, required for those mixed use uses.
Yeah.
And it doesn't contribute anything that we've got these folks who are putting in these very small mixed use commercial stuff that doesn't require any parking on top of it. Yeah. So you basically they put the little thing on the bottom, doesn't require any parking, and then they've got the residences that seem to require less parking than intuitively we would think they would need, because they get a reduction because they're within 6 blocks of the train station, on top of the fact that even without that it seems like it's not enough parking. And that's what, I mean, I think
Yeah.
some of us are struggling with.
Yeah.
And I don't know.
And that's all, very understandable. And it is policy based, and, the cost of parking is very high. And so there's a balancing act, right? And if what the planners, not just me, but you'll hear it from parking experts, and we've done, had parking experts come in and say, well, here's what's happening in the rest of the Bay Area. It's not just San Carlos. Here's what's happening in Berkeley or Palo Alto or Menlo Park. And here's the numbers. Here's what we're seeing in the numbers. And so the numbers may seem counterintuitive as well, but it's like what we did here. We took the data and we looked at the data. We looked at what was out in the field. And the other thing to consider here is where are you with housing? Do you want to create more housing? Do you want it to be? But if you require more parking, even though the data doesn't say it, and you're near transit, you're making the cost of housing much higher too. Mm-hmm. And so that's a sort of a policy decision that the community needs to make, and it's housing element. I mean, and that's something that you'll hear from the housing advocacy groups as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that and I feel like I'm talking too much, but I think that what I'm struggling with, and what I think some other people are struggling with, is what the data indicates just doesn't seem consistent with our experience. And data should be better than our experience. When I look at the south of Arroyo parking data, I only see two charts that deal with that in the packet that you gave us. One was it's figure 10, and the other one is figure 14. Both of those were done at 1 p.m. One was on Friday, and one was on Saturday at 1 p.m. So, to me, I kind of wonder, well, was there data for south of Arroyo?
See this? Yeah.
Was there data for south of Arroyo at 5 or 6 p.m.?
I think that the data is in the back part, I think.
Okay.
That's my recollection, yeah.
I tend to get distracted by pretty pictures. So
yeah, so the data it's in a bunch of tables in the back where you have the actual counts, and I think, does it talk about time there as well, Lisa? So it's all in the back. Like if you want to dig into the data, it's there.
It's
so
just not in the same
format.
graph. Okay,
Yeah,
I see.
Yeah. Yeah, it's more of a tabular format. And I mean, so, that's kind of how we put the report together, but the data is there.
Is there a way that the city can encourage or somehow market or sign or make agreements with the restaurants to somehow promote the Santrans ridership? Since, I mean, most people, if they think that, like if they're in San Mateo, they want to go to town, right? They'll have to get in their car and they'll drive. Whereas it's really not that hard to jump on and take the train, right? So is there anything that we can do to raise awareness and to try to change that model? Because that would, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if you give them a token or I don't know, some kind of incentive or just educate, but that seems to me like that could help if you could change the behavior.
Yeah. I think that's an excellent idea. I mean, and I think that's something we touched on that on the areas that we're looking for. But let's say the chamber or the city sponsored certain number of tokens per year. You give them, maybe the restaurants get them, you give them to them, or you incentivize it in some way, or they give you a free drink when you go in there if you take public transit or whatever, if you can prove it. I mean, there's all kinds of incentive programs that we could use in our community. I think that's a good idea.
You sure that you've got? I mean, I'm looking at Appendix A. That's parking. That's parking inventory data. Then Appendix B is parking occupancy data, which is where I would think it would be. But it seems like this is. It seems like this is all downtown. Is there any of this that's south of Arroyo?
Or are we looking in the wrong place?
Yeah, I don't see south of Arroyo. I see everything up into
Arroyo.
It's not in our packet.
I mean, I'm not trying to belabor this or put anyone on the spot. It's just I want to be able to continue to approve appropriate projects without agonizing over parking. I mean, that's kind of my end goal.
Yes.
It's not in here.
Yeah. So it may. Yeah, it could be. Let me see.
And hey, again, just going, and I know this is dangerous, but again, just going on experience, I usually don't have a lot of problems downtown. I mean, yes, things are parked up. I have to drive around. I'll move across the street on Laurel. I'm looking forward to having access to the Transit Village parking because that's where I'm going to park when I pick up my burrito.
Still kind of looking through the tabular data. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
I was saying that my concern is mostly being able to respond to residents who are coming in talking about the projects that we're trying to work through and saying I can't you can't do this because we already have impacted parking. There's nowhere for us to park. I'd like to be able to say to them, look, I was concerned about that too, but I've looked at the data and there's parking there.
Well, if you look at the data in the southern part, if that's your area of most significant concern, what the data indicates is there is parking available.
At 1 p.m. I'm more concerned, what the residents I think are complaining about is when they are coming home and they need to, park near their house. And
Let's
so
go
that's
back.
why
If we didn't include that data in here, we'll go see if we just missed it or or it was included or was not included.
Okay.
I mean, theoretically, we could still have that data collected if it wasn't in here.
Or, I can just, take your advice, which is usually very good, and I'm sure is here. Maybe I need to take a look for myself a little bit more. Just I'm rarely in that area in the evening.
Yeah.
But maybe I'll just rely on someone who lives over there.
I can tell you, I visited there in the last couple of weeks. I've been there. I've been to the South Laurel area to eat at the Salt Box, to kind of go down there for various reasons. And I walked the street behind just to see, at lunch. And there is, there you can see people parking up in the, up St. Francis and those streets. I mean, to a certain extent. Mm-hmm. But you'll still be able to find a parking space in a half a block. Mm-hmm. But you can see that there's folks, and you can tell that those folks aren't necessarily, you would just assume that they were there to eat at the Salt Box or eat at one of the other restaurants.
Sure. I would expect that, especially during the week. I would expect that there would be plenty of street parking in that area because the folks who live there are at work. Yeah. It's at 5 or 6 or 7 p.m. when they're home from work. Yeah. When I would expect it to be a problem. But I don't want to belabor this. Does anyone else have any questions, thoughts, concerns?
I got a couple of them. So I know you say the data, the conditions downtown really haven't changed all that much, but one thing that really has changed in the downtown is that in the last 2 years there's been an explosion of outdoor dining in the downtown. And every time a restaurant is full, and now you're putting all kinds of tables out on the sidewalk, all of those individuals need someplace to park. So I think there really has been a significant increase in the amount of parking in the downtown because of the new restaurants, because of the outdoor parking. I think that we have reached that tipping point, and I want to make sure that this is not just another study, but that they're going to come back with strategies, because I keep hearing words, we're going to do another study, and we're going to come up with strategies. To me, those are two different things. A study is going to come back and say, we need to do something. Again, a strategy is a report that comes back with strategies is going to say, these are the things that you need to do. And I want to make sure that that's the second step and that it's not just another study that's done to say, yeah, we either think we have a problem or we don't have a problem. I think that the uncomfortableness of all of us, it sounds like, is that there is a problem from our point of view. And that's making it difficult for us to say yes to additional projects. So this is a strategy report. This is not going to be just another study.
That's correct, yes.
And
Yeah.
and you've also mentioned a second study for permit parking.
Separate.
Is
Totally
that
separate from what we're doing here.
Is that another study or is that a strategy?
Well, for the greater East San Carlos neighborhood, it's more of a strategy. And in fact, I think that, but I think that in other neighborhoods, we're sort of not as far along
Okay.
as we are with the greater East San Carlos neighborhood. I mean, we've been looking at your neighborhood for more years and we have more direct experience with it. I think that the south of Laurel area is a newer, area of concern because in the last few years, I mean, even some of the restaurants that were down there weren't doing as well. And when the office came in, that really changed the landscape. So, I think that, we don't know enough. We don't have enough data. So I think the grant would be more, we would use this grant funding, if we get it, more to look at, do the inventory of that neighborhood. But again, with the greater East San Carlos, we know that you want it. We know the neighbors want it. We're probably going to, we'd maybe like to start with a couple of blocks or a pilot street or, so we're ready to kind of move forward with that as a separate thing, totally separate.
So I found the Arroyo information, and actually it's what it's showing at peak hours of 6 p.m. It goes anywhere between 75 and 100% utilized. So
Can you give me a page?
In what
Ken?
street is that?
it
Or
says,
what?
well, it says
block?
Arroyo and Walnut Street to Laurel, Arroyo, Walnut Street to Laurel Street, Arroyo, Laurel Street, or Laurel.
Is it part of B, Appendix B?
I'm not sure. It's got this.
Yeah, it's Appendix B.
This right? Am I looking at this right? Because there's your total number of spaces, and here's your times, and here's the breakdown.
Yeah, but
These are
none of
Walnut
that's
to Laurel.
none of that's South Laurel.
Well, okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's all.
It's all the other part. Okay.
Okay.
It's all north.
Okay. Sorry.
No, it's okay.
Okay.
On street? For South Laurel?
A couple of other things.
Not off street, but on street.
So, what really?
You don't see the Walnut Street south. Okay.
That was on street, so I'm sorry. Maybe I need to digest this a little bit more so I fully understand what's being said here. Where it says the street, and then it's the cross street, Walnut to. It's the cross street. It's Arroyo and Walnut, Arroyo and Laurel.
We can actually go back and look.
Yeah, they're Arroyo and Laurel.
Let's go back.
On-street parking at 6 p.m. is at 100%. Yeah, so that's an area that. If I'm understanding what I'm reading correctly.
Yeah, I just don't. I think you are understanding it correctly. I just don't think those areas are the area south of Arroyo that were.
How did we do this one?
We're really looking at
full
the
size?
area down near St. Francis Way,
Okay. Well,
I don't know.
down near the office, and the Salt Box
oh, down
and
south,
Three
further,
Pigs.
Even
Yeah,
further. Okay.
those three.
Yeah, so you can see on the screen, you can see the cross streets, Arroyo, Britton, Howard, American, or Belmont, Belvedere, White Oak. They do have data for all those streets. So if it's not contained in your package, we can certainly provide that to you. See, those, and that's all, most of it is on street, but they do look at some of those private parking areas, as you can see, those little boxes, you see the private parking areas, which are underparked for the most part.
The boxes are the private?
Yeah,
Okay.
those are the private parking areas.
Yeah, it'd be great to see this the 5 and 7 o'clock time frames encapsulated in this kind of visual.
Sure. Well, we can probably get you the data. I don't know if we can get you the visual. We can check. We don't have funding for that.
It's okay, I can highlight my own
Yeah.
map.
But we can,
We'll use the same colors.
but we can ask, maybe they could throw it in or something if they haven't already done it.
So what is this, or it looks like we're right above American Street. What's that number we're in that little yellow box? Is that private parking?
Yeah.
What is that?
That looks at in the 60, or no, is that the,
It's 85 to 89, okay.
yeah. Yeah, it's above 85%.
So you were asking some questions, Scott?
Yeah. So my question goes back. I've got a couple other ones also, but what I was sort of getting at is, what are the next steps for the east side? I know that, are you just waiting for the $10,000 from the Transit Village project? And is there some way to speed that up? I know the residents over there have been, for 15 years, have had to deal with this problem. And so I'm wondering if there's the city has, $10,000 somewhere to sort of, loan that program and then be repaid when the permits are pulled for the Transit Village. Because I think there's a tremendous amount of frustration over there, not only along where the Transit Village will go, but along Terminal. We heard from many residents when they were in here talking, and the parking along Industrial Road has changed to 2 hours, which is forcing a lot of those long-term parkers into the neighborhood. There's the potential hotel, which right now is the basketball camp or sports camps, and there's loss of parking on Old County Road because of the construction there. And now we know there's a possibility of a school going in over there, not to mention all the sporting events that go on at Loriola Park. So, and I understand from hearing secondhand that the Parks and Rec Department wants $5 million to update some building in Loriola Park and change the entrance. Unfortunately, the parking there is about 1/3 of what it should be for the park. So I'm hoping that increasing the size of the parking is included in that. But I just want to know what the next steps are. Or is it going to be another year or so before anything is done over there? Or is there some sort of a plan to actually implement this, even on a trial basis, on a couple of streets?
Yeah, I mean, we're working on it. I mean, one of the issues that we have is funding and resource. We have a resource issue. But I can assure you that we're committed to providing a parking program for the Greater East San Carlos neighborhood. I mean, I'm committed. I've talked to the Public Works Director. He's committed to it. We are having a little bit of an issue with regard to resourcing this and putting the right people on it. We're inundated, as you can imagine. We're going through a tremendous change and growth in our community, and we're getting pulled in a lot of different directions. But we are committed to doing this, and I think that you're going to see something sooner rather than later. I don't have a time frame for you, and I know people are pretty anxious. We've been talking to the Greater East San Carlos board, and they've done some local surveys, and they provided that information to us. That's helped us to get more funding for this. We're trying to look for other funding sources. So there's a lot to it. It's a lot more complicated than you can imagine. It's not just about establishing a parking program and walking away from it. It's if you get it wrong, we're going to have problems. So we want to get it right the first time. And so, and it may be more of an art than a science because some blocks may have different parking preferences and needs than the next block, and the businesses are going to have problems as soon as we do this, right? So we have to. There's a lot of moving parts. So we are thinking about all the parts of this thing, and after thinking about it for a little while, we recognize that we don't want to make any big mistakes with this either. We want to get it right and work with the community and have public outreach and we already have had some of that. I'm sure I'll hear more tomorrow night at the neighborhood meeting and talk to folks tomorrow night. But I can assure you that we're moving forward. It may not be as fast as people want, but we really want to do something over there and do it right.
Can I ask a question? Oh, I'm sorry,
Certainly.
Shannon. What percentage of the neighbors on any given block or part of the block have to vote in the affirmative for a residential permit parking program?
We were thinking 50% plus one.
Okay, so it's that low of a ratio. Yeah. Okay, and then just to make sure, because I lived in a residential area that had permit street parking, and there are many advantages to it, but there's also some challenges to it. And just to make sure you guys think about guests of people who live there and having permits for those guests. And just don't forget that. It will annoy the people who live there a lot more than it will everybody else. Trust me, I've been through it. Yeah. That's all I have to say on that.
And if anybody else has had experience with parking permits, I'd like to hear your experiences.
So what's the process for instituting the parking in lieu fee? I think you went over it already a little bit, but I didn't quite sink in. Is it something that has to go in front of council? They have to approve it? They have to figure out the pricing for it, and then it goes in front of the council?
Yeah, so the first step is to come up with the pricing for it. Since it's already on the books, it's more of, do we need to modify what we already have in place, which I don't necessarily think so, other than the cost. So what the consultant is doing is looking around the Bay Area at parking costs and the creation of a space, a surface space versus a structured space, and coming up with a fair share type of deal. We may not want to charge full rate for the creation of a park. It may not be fair to a restaurateur or retailer to say, you have to pay $30,000, for one space. Maybe we should bear part of the burden or half. So those are the kinds of things. So that's the first step, is to come up with a number and then figure out what's fair. And that would go to the Transportation and Circulation Commission.
Why would the city bear the burden of providing a parking space for a business?
Well, we're doing that now. We've done that for years and years.
I'm kind of curious about it. No, I'm just kind of curious.
The businesses, which increase the tax base, so it benefits the city.
Sometimes it's impossible, right? There's a lot of unlocked potential in our downtown, and it's constrained by because they can't create new parking. They have these little tiny footprints. Let's say they want to expand their business into the next, or put on a second floor or something. They can't do it. It's impossible. There's no land area to do it. So that's right. Some cities say we want to help business, and so in doing so, we will be flexible and be sort of a fair share. It's not an actual dollar that necessarily that we would bear the burden of. It's more, hey, do we charge them $30,000 versus 20 or 15? In Mountain View, at the time, I think we said that it was about $25,000 to create a space, and we charged $15,000 a space. And people gladly paid that over the years.
I think it's, just from the what I'm thinking is more of the new construction, the infill projects that we're working on. I mean, that's just a cost to the developer. If you're short on parking, it's just a normal cost to do the project. And I think we were last couple of years, 2 or 3 years, maybe the economy wasn't doing as well as it was, but it's a complete different ballgame now. And so if it's on the books, it just makes, I mean, to me, it makes more sense to start collecting that fee, whatever that amount is, as just a cost of doing business. You know, I mean, I'm a little less concerned about the small business owner that's going to be occupying one of those spaces, as opposed to the developer that is kind of sliding in right now. And the numbers are looking good for most of these guys. So otherwise, they wouldn't do the project, and they're pushing density. So might as well deal with the parking situation. It's on the books. So no, that's just my thoughts.
If you only charge them a partial cost for the creation of the parking space, does the city retain the ownership of that parking space, or do you cede that ownership to the business?
Well, the way it would be done is, for instance, let's say you had a single-story building and you wanted to add a second floor. Let's say you want to expand your restaurant, and to do the second floor, you need 10 parking spaces, right? But you can't do those 10 parking spaces anywhere. What would happen is the city, for instance, a city would charge a parking in lieu fee for those 10, and that would go into a fund for the creation of parking. So the money would go straight to the city's parking fund. There would, you know, the restaurateur or whoever it is would be able to build their square footage. So the city retains the rights to the cash that would then be put into the creation of new parking spaces that the city would own.
Parking spaces. Public parking spaces. Okay.
And or, again, the maintenance of what we have, too. That's another problem. Some cities don't have the funds to just redo the parking lots and that kind of thing, if you have a parking garage. But anyway, that's the way it's been done, and it's been done very successfully elsewhere.
Couple more questions. If you, and I hate to use the word, but Google any of the restaurants in the downtown, what happens is they take you right to that restaurant. They don't take you to a nearby parking lot. And so there may be an opportunity there to create an app for San Carlos that sends you to a nearby parking lot rather than the parking space that's right in front of that particular restaurant.
Excellent point. And if I could just add to that, we are working on a map of the downtown restaurants and businesses in addition to East Side businesses. And on this map, it will be on the city's webpage, and it will be interactive, and you will be able to click on the restaurant, go to the restaurant website, but you'll also be able to see the nearest parking. So we're actually working right now with somebody on putting together these, and it'll have an app.
Good.
So we're working on that.
So another question. We know we need signs, so why are we waiting for a survey or a strategy to do signs? Isn't that something that we could begin to move forward on sooner rather than later to sort of help direct people to parking, existing parking?
I think it's pretty low-hanging fruit. You make a good point. I think it's something that would need to be, although it's been identified, good idea, we need it. I think it is going to be more official in this Phase 2 document where the council says, and the TNC will say, you got to do this. Go ahead and do this. Now, it's not going to be cheap to do that, so we do need to come up with the funding. So I think it's getting it in this second phase and saying, yeah, this is something that we ought to do. Okay. So you're right. I mean, theoretically, we could start to go after it. It's a capital improvement funding issue.
And then the last thing is, I know at some point we're going to bring back the zoning ordinance, and I know at least a couple of us have had serious concerns about the TDM conditions and what individuals get points for, kiosks, Wi-Fi, things like that, just, at least to me, don't feel like they should count towards the TDM as far as working towards the creation of that 20% reduction. I don't know how the others feel, but I would like to look at what the conditions of the TDMs are in the city and see if there's some recommendations that we can make about maybe removing things or adjusting points or things like that.
I mean, I've heard that from others on the commission as well. You know, we love to look at this stuff. We love delving into these areas. The issue that we have, there's a number of different concerns and issues there. Perhaps the commission could vote to make a recommendation to the Transportation and Circulation Commission, or suggest it to the City Council as a body. But the issue there is, there are a number of other different objectives that the Planning Division and Community Development Public Works is asked to do, and those are typically put forward by the City Council in terms of our work and the resources that we need to devote to these things. The Transportation and Circulation Commission is typically the body that would uptake a project of this nature. It would be something that, the commission, I'm sure, since you are the implementing body to some a great extent, you would want to be involved in it. So it's something that will require a lot of research and time and effort to go into. And quite frankly, we need to be sort of given the walking orders by the council to some extent on this. And because, again, you're getting other commissions, other departments involved in it. So, I think it's great. Perhaps the commission can make that recommendation as a whole. And then we can kind of take that forward and say the commission is interested in this and go from there and see if we can get it as an objective on the city council's. We meet with the council every 6 months. They assign strategies and objectives to us. And
I'll make that recommendation if I think there's
well,
others
I think
who.
that we would need to agendize.
Okay.
I think if we were going to.
And I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Lisa just brought a good point up. I mean, again, we could bring somebody else in too. I mean, we could ask the City County Association of Governments to come in and provide you with some background information if you're interested. I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, do you guys want to delve right in and make some changes, or are you interested in becoming educated on how the plan was put together, where it came from? Because if that's the case, and I would assume that you would want to kind of learn some things.
I'd personally be interested in understanding how the actuals map against what the projected TDM is supposed to do. So if, let's say, a kiosk is supposed to reduce it by one trip, does it really reduce it by one trip? What does the data say? What does the research say as far as how accurate are those measures?
Yeah. And I mean, we'd be happy to have somebody come in and talk to you about those things. And in fact, as the City County Association of Governments put out a congestion management plan for the county of San Mateo. So, and each county actually has one of these things. It's called a CMP, a congestion management plan. They're the ones who assign the numbers, and their boards decide on a countywide basis, here's how we think you should do it. And what cities have done typically is adopted that methodology that was already determined by this other body, so that we're consistent with the rest of the county. Now, some cities develop their own TDM programs that maybe go away from that to some extent, but there are requirements that the city is required to meet if you go over a certain number of trips in the county, and you have to conform with this plan. So that's kind of how the big picture. So we could see if we can get somebody in, an expert maybe from the City County Association of Governments, one of their TDM people or traffic people, to talk to you about how they put this together and what those numbers actually mean and where they come from. I'd be happy to.
It'd be great
to bring someone
get
in.
that.
Maybe that's where we start with
that
this
will be-
thing or something.
I think that's a good start.
Okay. Does anyone else have any questions, thoughts, concerns on the subject of parking? All right. Well, I mean, before we move on to the next item, just want to thank you. I thought this was helpful. So, report on recent city council actions.
Let's see. At the last city council meeting, there was a discussion of the Carlos Club. And the city attorney had asked the council for direction in terms of code enforcement and moving forward with a code enforcement with the owner of the new owner of the Carlos Club. As you are probably aware, there was a great deal of public concern about the sign and the removal or damage of that sign and the historic nature of the sign and the building. And at that meeting, a number of individuals from the community spoke, and we got a tremendous amount of emails, phone calls, and things like that from the community. There was a 1,000-member petition to support keeping that sign. And we had been, city staff had been in close contact with the new owner of the Carlos Club, and we asked that the sign be restored to its original condition. Some of the bulbs were removed, some of the neon and things like that. So the owner agreed to restore the neon sign to the condition that it was in when he took control of the business. And he came to the meeting and said that he heard everybody loud and clear and that he has no plans to remove the sign. So that was a great relief to many people in the community. So as it stands today, the sign remains and will remain, and he doesn't have plans to do that. But he may have other plans for the business, and we have talked to him about temporary signage and things like that. But moving forward, we're not quite sure what he wants to do yet.
So there is no plan that has been presented to the city at this point for expansion of the restaurant or anything to date?
To date, there is no concept that has been
somebody
submitted
told me
to the
that
city.
there's already a plan and everything, and that the city's already approved it. And I said, I didn't think so.
No, not yet.
But I just want to make
no,
sure that
nothing like
that's
that.
clear. Okay.
Any other recent city council actions of note to the Planning Commission? Any Planning Commission comments or reports?
Was there something that was appealed and went in front of council that we approved?
It's not going before council until January.
Oh, okay.
That's correct. It's on the City Council's calendar of January 12th, and that is the lot split. I believe the address is 1316 Eaton Avenue, but that'll be going to the council January
Jesse
12th.
and me against the world.
Yeah.
We'll see whether we're vindicated or. Anyway, any other Planning Commission comments or reports? Any correspondence?
None for this evening.
Any planning staff comments, reports, and updates of current projects?
Yes, just a couple of things. The next meeting for the Planning Commission is scheduled on December 15th, and we have an item that'll come before you. I'm pretty sure this will be ready to go on December 15th. And this is a use permit for an existing business expansion. The name of the business is Sutro Biopharma. They are located at 930 Commercial Street, and they're going to be doing an expansion of their business operations and need a use permit to do so. The other item that I'm currently wrapping up is the number of additional zoning ordinance amendments that we talked about previously, one of them being allowing for hotels with a conditional use permit in the IL zoning district, among a few other cleanup items that we wanted to bring back So I am in the queue working on that, and that is something that it's possible that will come back before you on the 15th. The other item that I know that has been long awaited is the preliminary draft housing element. I think the commission and the community is going to be very pleased with our preliminary draft. We worked very hard to get it into good shape and update a lot of the information in it. There was a lot of progress made, and we want to make sure that we get all the numbers and all the facts and information correct, because as you know, once a document becomes public, it kind of takes on a life of its own. We're doing a good job to make sure it's accurate. So we think we're going to be able to release that at the end of this week or early next week. And what we want to do is have it be available for at least about a month before we present it in a hearing. As you know, in your packet, you have a lot of information to read, and certainly when you get a document, you want to have more time with it. So I think the upside is that the commission and the public will have more time to review the document completely before we give a formal presentation on the item. And right now we are queuing ourselves up for January 5th to do that. And I think at our next meeting, I'll provide the commission with a schedule for next year. So you have that, something to take away before we actually start the new year. And I think that's it.
All right. Well,
Any additional information on the potential school?
I don't really have too much to share with the commission. The Sequoia Union High School District is interested in a parcel that is adjacent to the Loyola Park. There's an industrial, it's right where you enter the park from Old County Road. And we understand that they're looking at a potential high school there. It would be, but it wouldn't be your traditional type of high school. It would be something on the lines of like something that would concentrate on health sciences or computer science or language immersion. So it would be a different type of a high school, 300 to 400 students, sort of a magnet school. And it would be open to San Carlos residents as well. So they're looking at, I believe they have an option to purchase this property right next to the park. And that's pretty much what we know at this point.
nothing would ever come to the Planning Commission, right, on that?
It
'Cause
depends.
they're zoning exempt, aren't they?
They are.
I just ask because my office represents the Sequoia Union High School District. So if anything were to ever come to the Planning Commission, although I don't think I have a conflict, I would probably end up recusing myself so that it doesn't create any appearances. But my impression is that it would be unlikely to come before us for any reason.
Is a CUP required for a school there, though? I thought that. Yeah, we'll check the zoning on that, but
Yes.
it is. Okay, so Scott already.
You're saying it is because you want it to be, or because you actually have some knowledge of what the requirements are?
I've actually looked at the zoning.
Well, then, just be aware that I'll probably end up recusing myself from anything having to do with the school.
Okay.
Do we know if the entrance to Loyola Park is actually owned by the city, or is it, do we have a right of way through that area?
We have an easement.
We have an easement.
So it's pretty, it's very strong.
Okay.
It's not like they can take it away from us, I don't think. Although, as the chair noted, the school district is exempt from city laws, but maybe not state law in terms of state land use, ownership laws, although they have some powers. They have the power of eminent domain and things like that. So I think that
They can't take the park, can they?
I don't, that's a legal question. But they want, I believe that the school district wants to work collaboratively with the city of San Carlos, as do most school districts. I mean, we've had a really good working relationship with our own school district here. And most of them want to be members of the, if they're going to come into your community, they want to be a member of your community and work closely with the residents and the government.
All right. Well, again, thank you. The presentation was very nice and informative and well presented. So unless there's something else, I'm going to adjourn the meeting. All right, meeting adjourned. Thank you, everyone. So yeah, my